My name is Joseph Smar. I'm an engineer on the Google Photos team, and I'm delighted to have Atul Singh here with us. I can't resist saying a little bit about his biography because I think you know that Dos Equis commercial for the most interesting man in the world. It's like a slightly dated reference by now, but so I think Atul might be my candidate vote if I had to vote for a real life most interesting man in the world, and maybe you'll see why in a second. So he was born in Goa, India, and quickly became somewhat infamous, I would say, because as a teenager, he became very active in protesting what he saw as the political corruption in the Indian royal families and Indian government and so forth, and developed quite a reputation. He then went on to become an officer in the Indian military and was in combat in Kashmir and in several other active combat zones against Islamic fundamentalists and so forth. Luckily, he seems to have survived. He then became a deep scholar. He has advanced degrees from Oxford and the Wharton School and other places, and was for a while a corporate lawyer at one of the most prestigious firms in London, representing Goldman Sachs and the London Olympics and other sorts of places. But in 2010, he decided to abandon all of that and start Fair Observer, which is a sort of news magazine journalism outfit it's a nonprofit with a very global focus. And for me, it's something where I've learned more and felt like I've gotten a sort of more deep and unbiased look at what's going on around the world and a more sort of integrated global approach to understanding the news than almost any other publication I can think of. And I think that's largely thanks to Atul, and he's actually recruited a sort of a network of journalists across the world to help contribute to Fair Observer, and he also writes for it himself, of course. And beyond that, he's also, you can go to fairobserver.com if you want to check it out. I would encourage you to do that. He's also written for Huffington Post and Al Jazeera and other places like that. In addition to that, he teaches political economy at both Berkeley and at the IIT and travels back and forth. He's a poet. He was a former Himalayan mountaineer. He has written an award-winning play. He speaks,
Not quite, but.
speaks 6 or 7 different languages from what I understand. And anyway, point being, I think you get the idea. It's a pretty unique set of background, and I think makes him I think uniquely qualified to speak to the sort of, there's a set of things going around the world right now, obviously, that have us all kind of confused and worried. And Atul's sort of integrative approach to both understanding the history and context of what's going on in each of these countries and also an ability to sort of synthesize it together, I think is what makes me so excited for him to come and talk to us about the global rise of the far right. So with that, please take it away. Thank you, Atul.
Thank you, Joseph, for your kind words. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege and an honor to be here. Thank you so much for coming over. Thank you, Joseph, for hosting me. I have to thank my team, first of all, and they are folks who have worked with me, trudged the lows, and, we are hoping for the highs. We have a managing editor who's written the book, The Arab Uprisings, and he speaks Arabic. And we have a deputy managing editor who's Russian, and her name is Anna Pivovarchuk. So imagine an Arab, a Russian, and an Indian heading a ship, and somehow it manages to work, and that's Fair Observer. And we have 1,600 plus writers. We are nearing to 1,700 writers now from over 40 countries. And the premise is very simple. The premise is, if I speak and I give you a point of view, that's one point of view informed by my experience, my cultural background, my philosophical beliefs, and my historical understanding. But if, let's say, I put forth my point of view, and Joseph did, and Shale did, who's sitting in the first row, and Alexander did, who's sitting in the back with a Sydney t-shirt, and so did others, then we would get to a better understanding of the world, because each of us has blind sides. And when we share ideas and we share our thoughts and we somehow think through things together, cutting across borders, backgrounds, and beliefs, we get a better approximation of the truth. So much so for the fundamental philosophical idea behind Fair Observer. I'm told I should tell everyone these days to like us on social media. I always forget that. So now, since I'm at Google, I'm telling you all to like us on Google Plus, of course, first, followed by Facebook and Twitter, and sign up for our newsletter. So now that I've done the mandatory pitch that my team would be proud of, let's get cracking into a rather somber issue. And the somber issue is, very frankly, the global rise of the far right. Now, before we carry on into examining what is the far right, let's understand what is the right. And I have a very advanced piece of technology in Google that helps me. It is this. It was invented a while ago, apparently in China. And there's another thing called this, which is pencil, right? And I tend to write my things like this, as you can see. I have really adapted to the 21st century. But if you look at the origins of the word, the right, it goes back to that wonderful event, or not so wonderful event, depending on your point of view, which was the French Revolution. And after the French Revolution, those who supported l'ancien régime, the old regime, sat on the right, à droite. And those who basically wanted revolution, and some of them wanted heads to roll, and heads did roll, sat on the left, à gauche. And those on the right believed in hierarchy, tradition, clericalism, which is, you should go to mass every Sunday. I doubt very many Googlers do. You're all sinners, right? Or not all, some of you are not sinners. But anyway, they believed, the people who sat on the right also believed that inequality and social stratification were the natural order of the universe, which, as George Orwell put memorably, some are more equal than others. So those who are clever and who are engineers work at Google, and those who have no skills except rudimentary pencil skills live like artists in a garret. That's the natural stratification of the universe, and I'm just a modern manifestation. And of course, those who do other menial jobs are further down in the pecking order of the universe and get paid accordingly. Now, that premise that inequality is important changes for the right over time. Instead of becoming something by birth, it becomes something by ability and effort. Now, what is that fundamental belief on the right? Which it is very simple. If you give everyone the same outcome, no one will work. And it won't be fair. So if Joseph works 100-hour weeks, he deserves a fine villa by the sea. And if, let's say, Shell is lazy, he deserves to be homeless and bum around. And maybe if Joseph is feeling charitable, he can give Shell a piece of bread and maybe some grill. And then Shell can be Oliver Twist and say, please, sir, can I have some more? But the premise of the right is very simple, is that the competitive free market is largely just because people should get what they deserve, the just desserts. Not desserts as in ice cream, but just desserts. And the competitive free market, according to this belief, is free. It is largely fair, and it rewards ingenuity and industriousness. So if you're innovative, you come up with a new idea, and you somehow make that idea popular by working very hard, you deserve greater rewards than those who don't. And in this belief system is another premise that markets achieve better outcomes than governments. Because governments are top-down, governments are authoritarian, governments don't have those price signals. So trusting markets is more efficient than trusting governments. And that brings us to something else, which I call the equity efficiency paradox, or equity efficiency paradigm. And that is in the era of the modern left, modern, I would say, post-Second World War, and right, is the fundamental defining feature for two sides of the political divide. If you are the Labour Party in 1945 and you've just won the election, you believe in a national health service because you believe that the inefficiency that will be inherent in the National Health Service, maybe the drop in innovation that might happen because of a bureaucracy, is worth it for greater equity. Everyone deserves healthcare as a right. That is a premise that the left all across Europe operates from. Everyone deserves schooling as a right. Everyone deserves certain inalienable rights that are more than just liberty of expression and belief. Now, if you're on the right, you say, the equity efficiency paradigm is getting a little too unbalanced, because what we believe is in freedom, and freedom includes the freedom to fail, and freedom includes, at its most extreme, the freedom to die. You just didn't make it in the evolutionary struggle. It's a Darwinian view. But there's something to be said for both sides, because when societies tip over to the extreme, far to the extreme of any side, they sort of meander and lose something intangible. It's that critical balance. And that critical balance is different for every society. Now, so much so for this distinction between left and right. Let us understand what is the far right. Now, the far right takes ideas of inequality and stratification to absurd levels. It bases them not just on birth, which is basically class and heredity, not just on outcomes, which is belief in the free market. It bases them on these ideas of nation, race, ethnicity, or even religion. So, the classic example is Nazi Germany. And Nazi Germany, lest we forget, was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. There was the word socialist in it. Most people forget that. Most people think they were just this far-right group which wanted complete unfettered freedom, and that included freedom to kill the gypsies and the Jews. But it was a little more complex than that. And that brings me to a second point. The first one that I made was the far right is predicated on nation, race, ethnicity, religion, etc. The second one is that the far right tends to be a strange amalgamation of the right and left, which is often forgotten. In terms of identity, it draws upon the right. It draws upon something primeval. It draws upon this idea that the German people, ein Volk, we are one people. We are somehow special. We are superior. All right. But the economics, now that everyone is special, now that everyone is superior, then suddenly turn left-wing. Because if everyone belonging to a certain race is superior, then no one should be starving. So you have Hitler Youth. You pack off all the nice, blonde, tall people to exercise and spend time in the countryside. And the Untermenschen conveniently to concentration camps. But if you are from the superior race, then you function collectively together. So, well, the Autobahn gets built. You have Keynesian policies. In fact, Nazi Germany has, if you look at it objectively, has more Keynesian policies than either the UK at that time or the US. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's economic policies and Adolf Hitler's economic policies are strikingly similar. Huge investment in public infrastructure for a start. Greater focus on equity. So, as I said, the identity for the far right comes from the right, and the economics of the far right comes from the left. It becomes a strange beast. And the Marxist view of Nazis is equally flawed as Friedrich von Hayek's views of the Nazis. Now, Marxists view it as the extreme corruption of a free market system, and they blame the rise of Nazi Germany on the capitalist model of government. Friedrich von Hayek, who taught at the University of Chicago, and mind you, he was a Viennese Jew. He had fled the Vienna that had been the center of the great Jewish intellectual renaissance just as the far right started rising, to London. And he taught at the London School of Economics and then made his way to the US, where his ideas were popularized in a Reader's Digest simplification of his work, The Road to Serfdom, and he used to shudder like good Austrian aristocrats often did, as did Freud, actually, at the simplification of his ideas in this wonderful, grand and glorious land. But fundamentally, Friedrich von Hayek says that, well, what you're seeing in the Nazi Party is the accretion of powers of the state, and once the state becomes too powerful, the individual loses liberty, and once the individual loses liberty, he becomes a serf because a bureaucrat, a petty bureaucrat, tells him what to do or her to do, and everything goes belly up. Peter Thiel would be delighted. As we know, he's very delighted with Donald Trump these days. He is a cheerleader for Donald Trump, except that he doesn't have very long legs and he doesn't wear short skirts, mercifully so, thankfully. Anyway, so why are we talking about the rise of the far right? The rise of the far right is important because of certain developments. And I'm not going to go through every country, but I'm going to take certain European examples because Europe has a history with the far right, and the European nation state, which was born in 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War, is the model everyone else adopts, with varying degrees of success and failure, whether it's Africa, Latin America, or Asia. And arguably, you can say that in the Middle East, the failure of the Westphalian model as demonstrated by the rise of the Islamic State and the reversion to the Shia-Sunni schism overlaid with tribal rivalries, overlaid with regional rivalries, overlaid with superpower meddling, has led to their version of the 30 Years' War. Now, you may not believe that. You may have a different argument. But what is certainly true is that the nation-state of Iraq, created through a stroke of the pen in the post-colonial era, and the nation-state of Syria, and many other such entities are actually de facto non-existent. But let's revert to Europe, and let's look at, let's say, 5 examples, 2 at the fringes of Europe, 3 at the heart of Europe. The first example is Austria, obviously, because Hitler was Austrian. People forget that. We have someone with an Austrian wife, and we have someone who is part Austrian. We have the rise of someone called Norbert Hofer. Am I getting it right? More or less. Okay. My apologies to all the Austrians for my terrible pronunciation. But this chap carries a Glock 9mm pistol. This chap is a 45-year-old aeronautical engineer. Now, you know, I am one of those people who failed to get into IIT. My rambling, brief biography doesn't demonstrate the fact that I've actually been muddled and confused and tried a few things and failed at more than one thing. But I didn't get into IIT. It makes me feel quite good about myself. You know, when I see 45-year-old aeronautical engineers who head the Freedom Party, which is everything to do with a lot of things except freedom. Now, he is against immigration. He has 4 children. He's the picture of family values. He wears a blue cornflower, which is a clandestine Nazi symbol, and believes in pan-Germanism and all that. And the interesting thing is he keeps pointing out that Austria is no longer safe because in 2015, 90,000 migrants/refugees were let into that tiny country, and they are rupturing the social contract. That sounds familiar, right? Now, just before you think Austria is unique, take a look at France. Marine Le Pen of the National Front, and of course her lovely niece, her highly attractive niece, Marion Maréchal Le Pen, who doesn't quite have a similarly attractive personality, but as French belles go, she's delightful and delectable to look at. But more importantly, the views of these ladies are disconcerting and disturbing. And what is even more disconcerting is, in December, in a regional vote, they got 28% of the vote. That is nearly a third. That is just a few votes off what the Nazis got when they won power. People forget the Nazis barely got a third of the vote. They didn't ever get a majority of the German vote. Now, her ideas have been derived from her father, Jean-Marie. And Jean-Marie once said Nazi gas chambers were a mere detail of history. So you're sort of getting the idea of where the party is coming from, but Marine has been very clever. Instead of focusing on Jews as a problem, she rails against Islamification, globalization, the EU, and the euro. It is an appeal to la grande nation, the grand nation of France, and the ethnic purity of France. And she's a complex character, but she's the new face of the French far right. She has succeeded her father and made the party far more respectable. Now let's look at Hungary. Well, I won't go too much into it, but suffice to say Hungary has a rising far right, which is dangerous, and Hungary was once a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Hungarians have a very strong sense of ethnicity and ethnic pride. For those of you who've spent time there, you realize the enormous pride, but that is now manifesting itself in slightly disturbing ways. The last two examples, the fourth example is Turkey. And everyone's heard of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and we know what is happening in Turkey, the purge, the targeting of both the Kurds and the Islamic State, but at the same time, Erdogan is Islamist himself. He's also targeting the Gulen movement, and so it's a very messy place. But he's appealing to an ethnic, religious sense of grandiosity, and he's building symbols. He's concentrating power. He's doing a lot of things which far-right leaders tend to do. Although so far he's never been considered really far-right. And of course, the fifth example. How could I leave them out? The fifth example is the wonderful Russians. Let's look at Russia. Vladimir Putin rode to power on a platform of ethnic nationalism by crushing the revolt in Chechnya. And over time, this sense of Russian pride has been strengthened. This sense of projecting power has strengthened. And the decaying Russian Empire, which morphed into the Soviet Union, and even when the Soviet Union collapsed, the decaying Russian Empire never entirely did, because you had Ukraine that continued to be in a sphere of influence. You had other minorities in Chechnya, Dagestan, etc., the Caucasus. And control was retained through an iron hand. Or there wasn't even, the velvet glove. The iron fist was bare naked and pretty bloody. If you look at Kadyrov, his henchman in Chechnya, he has a reputation of blowtorching people alive. So that's a very interesting look at the far right across Europe. Those of you who are Americans, and those of you who are not, who are just living here, but paying taxes here, now are seeing the spectacle of the rise of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, in more ways than one, reflects many of the tendencies and characteristics of far-right leaders. His economics, they tend to be more to the left. Protectionism, talks about putting Americans first, but his identity, Muslims are bad, they should not be allowed to come in. Mexicans, you need a wall, and Mexico's going to pay for it, and the wall's going to be huge. But all of which is code, in many ways, to a certain idyllic past. And he's appealing to certain ideas that have always been there. In some ways, arguably, they were made respectable by Ronald Reagan when he kicked off his campaign in Neshoba and talked about states' rights. Now that's where Mississippi Burning film was based on. That's where 3 Jewish anti-segregation kids were simply murdered. And so when he went and talked about states' rights there, and you can hear that speech on YouTube, it's code for you can have segregation again. And of course, he supported apartheid abroad. But what Trump is doing is taking it from code, from dog whistle standards, to absolute overt, naked, crude, rude, boorish intolerance, as well as an appeal based on ethnicity, based on a certain idea of America that runs contrary to certain other aspects and ideals of America, and one would argue the more dominant aspects of America. When I look around this room and I look at the various ethnicities, at the various nationalities, at the diversity that you see here, this could not happen in India. This is what makes the US special. The fact that you have some sort of a melting pot based across, which cuts across, shall we say, ethnicity, that cuts across religion, that cuts across many of the other ties that define other countries. But yet, America has also had an underbelly, because whilst it has been an immigrant country, it has also been a country which practiced slavery for a while, and much of the country was built on the backs of slaves. It has also been a country where the Native Americans were victims of really genocide. So there's an underbelly too that exists simultaneously. And what Trump is doing is appealing to that sense of pride and domination and strength. And the question is, how can people like Le Pen, Trump, and Hofer, right? Hofer, rise? Because frankly, they are a bit ridiculous and ludicrous, actually. Think of it. So was Hitler with his mustache and crappy hair, right? And all his strange gestures. I mean, he didn't look Aryan. I mean, he looked many things, but not Aryan, not his own version of Aryan. He wasn't a tall, blonde, particularly manly chap. After all, he had one ball. He didn't even have 2 balls. Now, so how are these ridiculous figures coming to power? And I have a premise, and I have ideas. I have 3 arguments. Like a good Oxford debater, you always have 3 arguments. Argument 1 is the far right is rising because of the failures of the elites, the multiple failures of the elites. The second argument is the rise of inequality. And inequality that is not just income, that is not just wealth, but also educational. Social mobility is dropping in large parts of the world, and that is really disconcerting. And the third argument is a failure of collective identity. By that I mean not just who we are, whether we are, let's say if you're living in Barcelona, whether you're a Barcelona or a Catalan or a Spaniard, but it is also a collapse of community. And you can see that in many parts of the world. So let us go to argument 1. Argument 1, the multiple failures of elites. Now, if you look at Brussels, a lot has, happened in Brussels. The EU has brought trade. The EU has brought the Schengen Agreement, which allows people to travel in and out. It has allowed mobility of goods, services, and people. But it is also a place that is narrow and technocratic. It is far too removed from the lives of the people. It is opaque. It is wasteful. The EU Parliament in Strasbourg is something the Parliament just travels to for a few days, for a huge waste. And because, this has been written in a treaty, now amending a treaty is too complicated, and the waste and the disconnect that the EU has acquired from the lives of the people is breeding a resentment. Because at the end of the day, narrow and technocratic leadership is not enough. There has to be a vision of where you're headed, what you're doing, and some fundamental delivery of solutions when a crisis hits. And a crisis has hit Europe. Europe has multiple problems. The euro is not exactly working. There is a debt crisis, partly because the euro was rushed and countries like Greece and Italy hired Goldman Sachs, did creative accounting, and that creative accounting let them in, and then everyone lent to them, thinking now that you had the euro, everyone was the same, everyone was Germany, and the chickens have come home to roost. And when the crisis came, the reaction of European elites was of typical petty bureaucrats. And people may not understand what is wrong, but they know something is wrong, and they want certain answers, or some promises of solutions, which are somewhat acted upon, if not in their entirety. Now, let's take another example of immigration. Immigration is an issue. Yesterday, I was sitting with a few Germans, all of whom are very anti-far right, but all of whom were talking about how immigrants have started posing a problem to safety. Some sections, not all. And they talked about a family that their friends had sheltered. They had come through very traumatic circumstances, and the young kids would go to school and beat up other kids. Because if you come from traumatic circumstances, you're traumatized, and now suddenly you're with other kids, and you're socialized in a certain way, and that is a problem. Immigration, which is too high, which happens too fast, creates social pressures, particularly if you're coming from a conservative society to a slightly, shall we say, open and hedonistic one. For instance, New Year's Eve in Germany led to mass attacks on women. Some were raped. And the government tried to push it under the carpet. That creates anger. The response of the elites, whether it is security, whether it is immigration, whether it is economics, has been very much a bit like Marie Antoinette, which was when the revolution began, we have no bread, and she said, why don't they eat cakes instead? And that riles the people. And that's premise one. And the failure is not just in Brussels. The failure is in London, in Paris. Look at Hollande. Hollande is like a chubby bank clerk. And I don't mean to be insulting to bank clerks. I think they are very dignified and do a great job. I just think that Hollande, as the president, is expected to exude a certain sense of direction, some vision. And Hollande is lost. His suit is far too big for him. And people resent that failure. Come to Washington, D.C. And I'm sure all of you are well familiar with this. You come to Washington, D.C., the way the institutions have now come to a grinding halt. Forget the partisan politics. That is a problem in itself. Let's take the example of congressmen and senators. Let's say Joseph was a senator or a congressman. Let's start with a congressman. If he was in a swing seat, he would be fundraising constantly. I have friends who are raising, on average, $18,000 to $25,000 a day for all their term. Now, if you're raising $18,000 to $25,000 a day, how many hours in the day does that leave you for writing legislation? Then you wonder why legislation is so shoddy. Well, there's a reason why. How much time does it leave you for sitting on a committee and holding the feet of the executive to the fire? Do the math. I mean, you're all engineers. The point is that a lot of the capitals are fundamentally broken. The institutions haven't evolved with the times. So that's failure one. Failure two, inequality. I won't belabor this point. There are statistics galore. I've kept writing about this issue for a year. And these are not my figures. You look at figures from the White House Council of Economic Advisors. You look at OECD figures. You look at figures from practically every government. And you see that income inequality, wealth inequality, educational inequality all of these have gone up, and social mobility has gone down. And when you don't have this feeling that there is opportunity, there is anger, particularly if people have come to expect opportunity, people have come to expect a lifestyle through media, which is more affluent, particularly if you have an age of consumerism, where people define themselves by what they have and what they consume instead of what they do and who they are. And so inequality is a major reason for a lot of anger. And part of it is because of technology, part of it is a trend, a broader secular trend of quantitative easing. If you print a lot of money and it doesn't show up in inflation, then asset prices go up. So those who own houses and those who own shares, they are wealthier. And those who don't, they can just continue, cleaning their rubbish and giving massages and teaching yoga. But that tension that comes in with the combination of increasing automation with not just, let's say, physical jobs as in a car factory, but also increasingly skilled jobs with artificial intelligence, when you don't need that many people. And combine that with quantitative easing, it makes for a grim spectacle, and people get angry. How do they find things to do to fill their time with, and how do they earn their daily bread? Now, the third thing, and this I think is fundamental and often overlooked, is this idea of collective identity. Who are we as a people? Man is a social animal. Plato said that a long time ago. All the Eastern philosophers have said it. You don't exist as an island, or man or woman. There is a set of weaving, inextricable, intricate relationships that every individual manages to have through life. And if you get isolated, it creates a lot of anger. And what has happened is that communities have sort of broken down in the age of consumerism. Neighborhoods lack cohesion in large parts of the world. You take the example of India, where you have enormous violence now in the north, where rape is a real and tangible concern for any woman going out in the evening in the north. You take, for instance, this issue of enormous PTSD amongst US demobilized troops. In the older times, not that things were perfect, things were terrible in many ways then. You had serfdom and slavery and whatnot. But in older times, often when soldiers came back from war, they went back to their village, their whole community support structure. Now when you come back, you're coming back to a suburb. You might end up having a divorce. Your wife may leave you. You may end up getting into a spiral of addiction. You may not have that support structure of the community. And that lack of community support structure, that lack of autonomy, self-autonomy, leads to not just anger, but also identity. And Freud talked about this a lot. He talked about it as Nazism was on the rise, and his insight was that there are destructive forces that lurk and emerge, particularly in times of crisis. And during these moments, when this happens, then people look for certain certitudes in life. And that certitude can be very appealing if it harks back to a golden age. The Nazis were harking back to a golden age, a pristine age of idyllic identity, the folk memory of Germany. If you look at Islamic State, what does it say? It says there is this book, right? The Quran. This gives you an entire template of life and afterlife. Describes everything. And this is it. This will be your salvation. Now, it's a very powerful appeal if you believe in faith. Now, a lot of times when people believe in religion, it just helps them provide an expression of spirituality. It helps them gain a sense of cultural continuity, and it is a fulcrum of a community. But when things become literal and fanatical, and you have priests who are telling you what these books mean, whether it is this book, which is the Bible, of course, which a lot of people hark back to in this country, and they say, check the Bible, and they claim that this is the reason why you shouldn't have right to abortion, or this is the reason why you should support X and oppose Y. You're getting an absolutist, fundamentalist point of view that harks back to a pristine golden age, that harks back to certitude and truth, that harks back to clearly codified definitions. It provides you a map of everything at a time of great volatility and uncertainty. But just before people jump to the conclusion and say, oh, religion is bad, the flip side is that any ideology, not just religion, which revolves around far too much certitude, whether it is Nazi thought as penned by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf, whether it is Stalin, Joseph Stalin and his idea of fundamentalist communism, or it is even Mustafa Kemal and his idea of Turkification, which was terrible for the Turks, by the way. Sorry, but terrible for the Kurds. Any idea that bases itself on the certitude of a collective identity that is ethnic or religious or racial ends up in a lot of blood and tears. And perhaps that is part of the human condition, because we like to define ourselves in tribes. After all, here at Google, you wear your tribal signifiers. I see Google T-shirts, and we want to believe in some kind of collective mission and identity. Perhaps that is in many ways wonderful, because it allows people some common identity, common purpose, and common goals. But when it's taken to an unhealthy degree, when it is taken to an irrational belief that is beyond questioning, that is beyond dialogue, that is beyond debate, then the worry begins. And the point that I'm making is these forces of irrationality, these forces of hearkening back to comfort and an infantile sense of security, which actually Eric Fromm talks about in Escape from Freedom, because freedom can be a terrifying thing. It leads to loneliness, it leads to isolation, it leads to atomization. If we are disconnected from each other, from one individual from another, if there are far too many uncertainties, then we want to go back to a comforting infantile state, back to being a child. But as an adult, it's not possible, and therefore you seek this connection with a father figure, with an authoritarian father figure who promises peace and tranquility and a happy family in the Garden of Eden. Doesn't quite work that way. But this collapse is particularly important. After all, who are we? What is our tribe? How do we base it on? How do we base our collective identities and collective purpose on? And we've not been able to define that. We've not been able to put together a vision of a truly diverse, truly inclusive community. There has been this loss of, in some ways, and the chipping away of the soul. And that is the big challenge that irreligiosity has brought. Because being highly irreligious has its own problems sometimes. Everything is me, me, and myself. Everything is what I consume. And so, for me, if we have to beat the far right, and we have to beat the far right, because it's a hugely destructive force on the planet, it is very regressive, we have to address the three challenges. We have to come up with more coherent vision whether it is the economy or whether it is identity or whether it is any problem or challenge that is affecting the lives of many, we have to address inequality, and we have to come up with ideas of collective identity, some kind of global citizenship, some kind of template and vision for commonality, some kind of moral purpose, if we've got to even the keel again. And with that, I welcome questions. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you. Please.
Thanks. Thanks for your talk. Very, very informative. I have extended family members who are Europeans. Very early in the Trump campaign, when I was still kind of in a eye-rolling stage, they said, "Oh, we've seen this before. It's fascism." And that word really kind of got my attention and brought me to focus on the fact that, yeah, Trump represented a portal to devolvement that we needed to keep shut. I was curious, I don't think I heard you use that word, and I wondered if you think of fascism differently, and if so, what are the differences, or why do you shy away from that word?
14-year-old or a 12-year-old? Was it 14-year-old? Asked me the same question on Sunday. So it's glad to see, a very perceptive question coming from two different generations. And the reason I don't use the word fascism is because fascism is just one of the many center-right ideologies that evolved. It has become very popular. It's become a term that is bandied around. It's basically Mussolini's, ideology, bare-chested, thumping his chest and going and, working as a worker and at the same time talking about grand nationhood. It's a weak form of Nazism. And so, yes, fascism, he's fascist. We could use a word, he is far right, or we could say he's proto-Nazi. But these are terms. I don't like using fascism because fascism is a peculiarly Italian phenomenon, and I think every country has its own version of the far right. For me, what is much more dangerous and what we have to keep sight of is the way Trump is attacking ethnicities and people of different faiths. Now, the classic example is this young Muslim captain who was killed. Now, in America, yes, the elite does not send its children to fight. None of the Googler's kids are likely to go and fight, unlike the British upper classes who did in the First World War. But in America, there is a veneration for soldiers and the war dead, at least publicly. And that's an unwritten rule. You always say we honor our veterans, we honor our soldiers, we honor our airmen, we honor our sailors. Of course, we won't let our kids become them, but we honor them. What Trump is doing is that he's attacking someone who died fighting for the country. And in the American mythology, is almost a saint. And he's doing it only on the basis of they are Muslim. And he attacks the mother and says she was silent, maybe she wasn't allowed to say something. What he's trying to do is conjure up a specter of Islam wherein women are not given rights. He's playing into those fears, wherein those who are gay, like Peter Thiel, will be shot dead or burnt alive, wherein intolerance is the name of the game. He's helped by the fact, of course, that certain incidents do happen. Men from North Africa do attack German women in public pools. That is happening. But that is not all of Islam, right? That may be, from that society, that may be a failure of German public order, that may be many, many, many things. But he's conflating disorder with Islam. It's very much like painting an image of, the blood-dimmed tide of barbarians is on the horizon, and they're all riding on their steeds, and they are like the Mongol horde, except that they all have the crescent the Green Crescent, and we have to rally together and fight them. So he's basically trying to pull together white America largely under his fold against an extremely dangerous enemy. That's the gambit he's playing. But I wouldn't like to use the word fascism because Mussolini didn't really play that gambit. It was more Hitler who did. So you see, that's why Mussolini was Hitler light. Italy declared war, and all the sailors were out eating pasta with the mama, and the British bombed the fleet. It was on the bottom of the harbor. Huh? So for me, Italian politics is a bit of a joke. So Mussolini says we want to go to war, and we'll go to war, but of course the fleet is sitting in the harbor, and what do the Brits do? They come and they bomb the fleet, and it's bottom of the harbor. My tutor at Oxford used to say that, you know, his family members used to joke that when they went to fight in the Second World War and they were having a snowball fight, the Italians came out saying, "Mamma mia, don't shoot, we surrender." So, you know, fascism is something which is a term which for me is in some ways cliched. What is more important is to understand the danger of a particular ideology and address it. Because if you say Trump is fascist, then you get into a debate as what is fascism? What does this term mean? And then people say, well, he's not entirely fascist because he's different in this way and that way, and he's representing a lot of genuine concerns. He's against the establishment. He's giving voice to workers who have been suffering under free trade agreements.
So this talk has been about the far right, and I agree.
Yeah.
You know that is a rising concern. But what maybe you could address sort of not only has there been a sort of a rise of the far right, but what I view as like a hollowing out of the middle, right? So as the right has pulled right, then again I have an American lens on this. As the right has pulled right, the left has pulled left. You know, you've seen the gridlock in Washington. Bernie Sanders, sort of a personification of that left. You know, my initial sort of thought is like, well, let's all move towards the center. But as someone on the left, I'm afraid that if I move a little bit to the right is going to move even farther to the right. And so how do you deal with this, again, hollowing out of the middle?
I don't know if the left has really moved to the left, because frankly, it is starting to move to the left with the rise of Bernie Sanders. But if you look at 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1989, collapse of the Berlin Wall, Francis Fukuyama, who basically sits not too far from here, a little bit further down in Palo Alto, that place called Stanford, right? He said, oh, the end of history, right? That's what he called. And I remember, even as a young chap when I was reading it, and I've met Francis, he's a lovely chap, but only an Americano could write that, I'm sorry. I come from Varanasi, which has 5,000 years of history. My ancestral city is a stone's throw from where Buddhism began. When he wrote End of History, history never ends. There is no final destination that you get to. It evolves, it flows like a meandering river. Or maybe I'm just Buddhist, philosophically Buddhist, but anyway. But the point is, post-1991 was the triumph of the Milton Friedman-style capitalism, which is markets are all, markets are God, let's privatize everything. Well, Russia did. What happened? You can privatize if there's a fair auction. But let's say the state owns everything. All of you collectively supposedly own everything, but you are the Politburo chief. And you say, I'm going to privatize all the chairs now. They are to be sold, the state cannot control it. And it turns out that the chap sitting to your, left is your brother-in-law, and you say, okay, the real price of all the chairs may be $100, but I'll sell it to you for 10 cents. And what happened in the move towards market was privatization of public property through criminal means. Criminal syndicates emerged and took charge. And you've got to be important with things like, you've got to be careful with things like property rights, because if you have very extreme property rights, you only get a society of czars and serfs. And that's exactly what Russia has ended up again. Now, so through the 90s, the left moved to the right. It was Bill Clinton, Slick Willie, right, who repealed Glass-Steagall, right? It was what FDR had brought in after the Depression. The Graham-Leach-Riley Act, if I get the name right. It was like, yes, banks should be allowed to merge and financial services will be wonderful. Let's have lots of derivatives. And his Treasury Secretary was an ex-Goldman chief. And then, of course, the supremely arrogant Larry Summers was the big boss. And, of course, what's the difference between Larry Summers and God? Well, you could take what someone said about Larry Ellison and replace it. And they were doctrinaire in their belief that you just had to liberate markets. And it was a Democrat government. It was a Democrat president who did that. Now, obviously, these were the excesses because Soviet Union had collapsed. Everyone had this naive belief in the markets. They were all, I call Bill Clinton the stepchild of Ronald Reagan. I'm sure he doesn't like it. But he was in economics. He certainly was. And so you get this, the left moves to the right. And then who represents the working classes? The white working class suffered as jobs moved and is angry. And that is why, ironically, it is flocking to Trump. Because Trump is personifying anger against the system. Because right now, you're seeing two forces. One is the establishment, and the establishment are people who sit in Washington, D.C., or dare I say even Google. Those who have benefited from globalization. Why? Because everyone uses Google Maps. Everyone uses Google Search. I couldn't live without Google. I function of Gmail and I function of Google Docs. So I am, whether I like it or not, in the Google empire, in the Google ecosystem. I couldn't leave it even if I wanted. So Google is a big winner of globalization. But then there are those who are really against the establishment, who've lost out, and they want to smash it to smithereens. Because their concerns were not addressed. They were never trained. They suffered the Reagan Revolution, wherein investment in the criminal justice system and prisons exceeded that on schools. Today, a lot of Americans are starting to send their kids to private school, fancy private schools. I know some friends here. So if you've gutted out your public school system, that means social mobility is gone, jobs are gone. You can, of course, become a barista, but better jobs are not available. So, there was this entire abandonment of the economic interests of large numbers of people. So the left moved to the right. And it's only recently that the left has started swinging left again. But now Marx is dead. All right? There is no counterpoint, so they are confused. They don't know what they want. So the left is in complete confusion. Anywhere you look at England. Jeremy Corbyn, he has no idea of what he believes in. Right? So the entire politicking, the opposition to David Cameron came from his own party. It was Boris Johnson who sank Cameron's boat, not, of course, the wonderful opposition leader. So the left is lost. The left, in the memorable words of a friend who's a young politician, said the left has been left out. So left doesn't even know who it is. So I think the left is sort of starting to figure things out and has moved to it's starting to gravitate back again under Bernie Sanders, but I don't think it's moved to the right at all. And I think what has happened is that the right has moved extreme right. The center of gravity started tending towards far too much insanity. I mean, look at Ted Cruz. He makes Donald Trump look good. I mean, pull up the video and watch his video on machine gun bacon, wherein he cooks bacon on a machine gun. He fires until it becomes hot. And, it's a wonderfully incongruous sight to see a chubby middle-aged man act very macho. I mean, I would much rather he ran a triathlon to show me how fit he was. But no, he's appealing to something very deep. So what is happening? But now what is happening is that the economics of the right are turning left. So it's a very confused time.
So I think when you're looking at fascism and all this movement in history, you're kind of like a little bit scratching the surface, making fun of Italian Navy and Hitler and his mustache. But really, those were like counter-revolutionary movements against what was happening in Soviet Russia. And there was a moment of restructuring for capitalism worldwide. So I think what is really key is the economic situation in the world that we should looking at instead of just like looking at Ted Cruz or ridiculous it is. So I think the key here is inequality, and it was one of your three main points, but I think it is the main point. So I want to know what you think about that.
It's a very valid point. Yes, inequality is key. But remember that the Nazi Party and, let's say, Italian fascists were strange in the sense they were counter-revolutionaries, but in some ways they were also revolutionaries. Because the Nazi Party was not the upper-class Prussian Junker class. Let's be very clear. The Prussian Junker class suffered under the Nazis. The aristocrats often got the boot, often with their lives. It was a lower middle class, petty bourgeoisie. The lower middle class that wanted to kick the upper classes and take power themselves. It was a power grab, but they didn't want the workers, their workers, to take over power. So it's a little complex. You see what I'm getting at? So, pardon me? Pardon me?
The industrial class. So like
it was a power grab, certainly, and certain classes flourished, but parts of the old elite got wiped out too. So it's
capitalistic destruction, right?
It was a partly, but it was not entirely capitalistic because the state was involved. It was collectivist as well. It's complicated. That's what I'm trying to get, is the state, the bureaucrats were very heavily involved. And I think you're right, economics is key. You know, a long time ago someone said it's the economy stupid. And that's part of the answer, for sure. But economics is not all, because you can not just have growth and things will be all okay, as China is demonstrating. But at the same time, if you have no growth and you're like France, you're stuck in over 10% unemployment since 1980, and you've got massive unemployment in your banlieues, which is where you've got all these Arab kids unemployed and unemployable, then they start getting radicalized, as you can see on the Côte d'Azur. Côte d'Azur, which is a place where the rich stay, is also a place where the radicals come and flourish. And the radicals grow. So it's complex. But I agree that you have to figure out how do people find jobs and how do people earn a living? Or if they cannot, if we have so much automation, then maybe it's time to think seriously about what Keynes said. Maybe we should all be writing poetry and, and debating philosophy. Build a greater sort of, Athenian republic. Now that we don't need slaves, we can have robots instead.
This question is not about the global far right, but instead about the media. And it's a rather incongruous time to be setting up a media organization, and particularly with the likes of Google News to compete with, for example. And I wondered if you could comment on what you see as the what's necessary in terms of the evolution of media going forward, and how Fair Observer fits within that.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that question. That's an almost entirely different talk. I gave a talk in MIT earlier this year, and and that was on the role of the fourth estate in the New World. And the New World is a riff-off from Michael Lewis's book about the internet, and fourth estate is what Edmund Burke, an Englishman, called the press, which was sitting in the Parliament for the first time and watching the three estates, the royals, the clergy, and the commons. And so we have lots of blogs and lots of noise on the internet. That's one. And we have huge media conglomerations, which through mergers and acquisitions have become concentrated in basically numbers that you could count at most on two hands. So you have a monopoly of sorts, or an oligopoly of sorts. And the profit-driven model in the US means that everyone's chasing a headline, and you have a dumbing down of news, and attention spans have gone down, and so discourse has vanished. And I'm of the firm belief, not opinion, but belief, that democracy needs discourse. If you don't have discourse, you won't have democracy. And so why am I setting this up? We are a nonprofit for a reason. I don't want to be beholden to a venture capitalist who has a target on my back and says, hey, why aren't we at 5 million uniques a month by now? So my idea of a media organization now, particularly with the change in political circumstances, is that it has got to be independent, it has got to be fair, it has got to be diverse, it has got to be truthful, it has got to be credible. It has got to have this identity that brings together people across cultures. And yes, it is hard competing against Google News. Yes, it is hard targeting people and getting them to read in depth about, let's say, Turkey and examine it historically or philosophically. But where I see Fair Observer, frankly, as this new age intelligent readers or intelligent audiences home, where people are cosmopolitan, people have an interest in issues of importance, people are globally minded, where people are willing to question assumptions, where people want to be informed and educated, and in turn inform and educate others. And it is very much in keeping with a great tradition of, let's say, Benjamin Franklin running his own newspaper, or Gandhi running his paper, or any of the leading lights. And the funnel is really wide. You can say wild too. And the filter is really strong. So everything goes through a quality check and a fact check and a language check. And what we aim to be is independent, and that requires donations from some of our readers, if not all. That requires grants from certain organizations. That requires philanthropy. That requires over time monetizing through various activities, whether it is organizing events or conferences or selling premium subscriptions, or for that matter, doing workshops, delving into the education space. Because one of the things that is lacking is this civic education, looking at things in context, looking at things across time. And that is why one of the things we do is the Voices of the World program, wherein we go and train people how to think critically, express themselves clearly, and engage with the great issues of our time. And with that, I think I've come to the end of my time. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you.